Catholics destroying statues, hypocrites or theologically sound activists. This is a video discussing Christian freedom, the liberation from cultural taboos, and speaking about the unrightful judge. On October 4th, Pope Francis witnessed an indigenous performance at a tree planting ceremony in the Vatican Gardens. The presentation was performed by Amazonian people holding hands and dancing in a circle around a wooden statue of a nude, pregnant indigenous woman, said to represent the Virgin Mary. Participants sang in honor of the feast of St. Francis and danced in a manner similar to traditional South American Mother Earth festival rites. Pope Francis remained seated in a chair away from the ceremony, bored, unamused, and not paying much attention throughout most of the performance. The ceremony included bowls that held dirt from different places around the world, representing different ecological issues. The people set up a net on the ground that held pictures of martyrs for Catholicism and Christianity in the Amazon, mostly women and priests, who have died to bring the faith to an otherwise polytheistic, nature-worshipping culture. Most scandalous was what appeared to be an old wise woman, which is coded language for a medicine woman or a witch, who approached the Pope and presented him with a black ring, and seemed to gesture her own blessing. The black ring is a popular symbol in Brazil and Latin America of liberation theology, a movement that tried to marry Catholicism to socialism, a movement many North American and U.S. Catholics consider heretical. The event was organized by outside parties, including the Ford Group. The woman referred to the statue as Our Lady of the Amazon, and the Pope seemed to bless it. The Pope then prayed an Our Father and skipped his prepared remarks like any good politician would do when he realized a photo op went sideways. Then he left the performance without comment after the tree was planted. The bigger scandal is how Catholics then acted following this event, especially American and Canadian-based YouTubers and Twitter users who claim to be Catholic, at first sounding like Savonarola at the bonfire of the vanities, and then like fundamental Protestants railing against idols in the church, and then finally like Muslim fundamentalists screaming for their religion, here, Catholicism, to be the prime religion of the world and calling for an end to religious freedom. The reaction made us look worse than the event, which was already egg in the face for a church that has been rocked by one too many scandals in recent years, including unforced controversies concerning backlash from Ultra-Traditionalist Catholics, people who literally want to bring Latin back into vogue, against Pope Francis, whom they see as too liberal. Now, after watching the ceremony a few times and doing some research, I've come to some conclusions. First, the supposed pagan ritual doesn't seem to be much of one. I've done a fair bit of study on pagan and neo-pagan rites and rituals, and this was not one, at least not a complete one, though it did seem to be stealing back or appropriating elements of native Amazonian rituals, which is something the Church does allow, as some tribal African Catholic churches do have dancing and rhythmic chants as elements in their celebration of Mass. And this is something I am familiar with as a Hispanic and someone of Native American descent. As we allow mariachis, clapping, and hand-holding at Spanish Mass. In fact, this performance looks very reminiscent of liturgical dances that might be performed around a religious theme, such as the Virgin Mary, whom is very popular among Hispanic and Latin American Catholics. While some might smear this as mere folk religion or folk Catholicism, the Catechism of the Catholic Church does give license for the Church to incorporate the customs of the cultures that it assimilates. But there is one other aspect to this event that I'm leaving out. That is the conspiratorial accusation that these statues were not of the Virgin Mary, as Vatican officials seemed to try to claim, nor even of a generic non-divine Mother Earth, as some liberal apologists have tried to defend, but that these were actually pagan idols of the goddess Pachamama, of the Andes Mountains, and Incan civilizations, which would be odd but not impossible for Amazonians who have their own pantheon to be worshipping, let alone self-professed Catholics, including a Franciscan brother, who would know better. And if it was a pagan rite dedicated to Pachamama, it was done horribly incorrectly, as her religion still exists, and videos of her ceremonies can be watched on YouTube dating back to 2011. Her rites use a collection of fallen leaves, sacred fire, and a collection of stones, none of which was part of the performance at the Vatican. Regardless of the legitimacy of the accusation, this led to some supposed Catholics, and two men in particular, to enter the church of Santa Maria in Transportina on October the 21st, and for them to steal the wooden figurines and then throw them into the Tiber River to destroy them, showing us Catholics to be reactionary, impatient, and petulant, if not simply short-sighted to the precedent we are now establishing, that it is now acceptable for people to enter a Catholic church and remove items that they consider idols that offend them. This is a poor example we are showing the world. As of the writing of this script, the video of that crime, the crime being trespassing, theft, and destruction of church property, had 60,244 views. But my opinion aside, I decided to see what the Bible, and what more specifically St. Paul, had to say on this issue. So I looked at what to me were the most relevant passages, those being in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, chapter 5, and chapter 6. I have read these epistles many times over the years, and every time I do, I find them eye-opening. This time was no different, as it changed my position and stance on this topic. To understand this following interpretation of Paul's writings, we must remember that we are interpreting the Bible spiritually, allegorically, morally, and analogically, not strictly literal or historical, but instead metaphysical and theological, and for me personally, with or through a philosophical lens. Now, let's continue. So let's see, and let's start off by looking at the performance and the gifting of the ring. And let's say, for argument's sake, that it was a pagan ritual performed within the Vatican garden. What then? 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 6 through 15, says this: "These things happened as examples for us, so that we might not desire evil things as they did, and do not become idolaters, as some of them did. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink, and rose up to revel. Let us not indulge in immorality, as some of them did, and 23,000 fell within a single day. Let us not test Christ, as some of them did, and suffer death by serpents. Do not grumble, as some of them did, and suffer death by the destroyer. These things happened to them as an example, and they have been written down as a warning to us, upon whom the end of the ages has come. Therefore, whoever thinks he is standing secure should take care not to fall. No trial has come to you but what is human. God is faithful, and will not let you be tried beyond your strength. But with the trial, he will also provide a way out, so that you may be able to bear it. Therefore, my beloved, avoid idolatry. I am speaking to you as sensible people. Judge for yourselves what I am saying." These verses serve as a warning that we are not above temptation, and that we too can fall if we are unwise and not careful. But it also shows that all worship is sacramental, even false worship. St. Paul also confirmed the point that an idol is nothing, as we can see more clearly in the verse that follows. For then, at verses 19 through 22, the theme continues. So what am I saying? That meat sacrificed to idols is anything? Or that an idol is anything? No. I mean that what they sacrifice to demons, not to God. And I do not want you to become participants with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and also the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord and of the table of demons. Or are we provoking the Lord to jealousy, anger? Are we stronger than he? This passage makes several strong but quick and glossy statements. It reaffirms that God created everything. Thus, everything is clean. Only sin perverts it. It is only the offending of sensibilities and the confusion it can and does cause that is the problem. For a person can no more change God than move a mountain with a bare hand, or change the direction of a hurricane with the wave of a finger. And while we do have rights as humans which were endowed by our Creator, these inalienable rights ought not to alienate us from the other. This is a caution against overconfidence. But I will take umbrage with a plain and simple reading here. For then we get to the mystical and metaphysical concept of demons. But I will take a conceit from St. Augustine and assume that idols being of demons, or a gateway to them, has more to it than just the literal meaning. Here I think the word, or threat of, demons seems to be a warning to the Bronze Age audience against the non-divine realities of sin, that there are temporal consequences and corporeal consequences, and not just the moral, ethical, or metaphysical consequences we think of and seem to concentrate on as spiritual and religious people. So the principle Paul sets up here is that you, that is we, must operate in regard to others. We must avoid what might cause scandal and confusion to others who do not know what we know and who do not understand what we understand. And instead, we ought to prefer what is beneficial and edifying to that which we may find tolerable, enticing, or entertaining. In that way, we seek the good and well-being of the other person and not just the good for ourselves. Though through this, we can acknowledge that idols of any kind are at best neutral representations, at worst a temptation to error for the uninformed, ignorant, unenlightened, and fools among us. The strong should consider the weak, for if idols can provoke God to wrath and passion, how can we mere mortals claim to be immune to their effects or presence? But the problem here comes from what we define as an idol. As Catholic churches are full of statues of the Virgin Mary and many other saints, and even art that contains devils, demons, and even Satan, even if they are of those evil spirits being cast out, defeated by our saints and angels. And again, I will steal from St. Augustine and other church fathers. Evil desire is the root of idolatry, not man-made things, that is the work of human hands, for the goal of a good Christian and a well-catechized Catholic is always to maintain koinonia, that is, fellowship, and that fellowship or unity is more important than expressing already attained liberty. It also shows that God always provides a way to reject polytheistic rituals. For me, this was done at this situation we look at today, when the Pope said the Our Father instead of his prepared statement. But this passage also looks at the other side of the coin on this issue. For at verses 23 through 33, we read, "Everything is lawful, but not everything is beneficial. Everything is lawful, but not everything builds up. No one should seek his own advantage, but that of his neighbor. Eat anything sold in the market, without raising questions on grounds of conscience. For the earth and its fullness are the Lord's. If an unbeliever invites you and you want to go, eat whatever is placed before you, without raising questions on grounds of conscience. But if someone says to you, 'This was offered in sacrifice,' do not eat it on account of the one who called attention to it, and on account of conscience. I mean, not your own conscience, but the others. For why should my freedom be determined by someone else's conscience? If I partake thankfully, why am I reviled for that over which I give thanks? So whether you drink or eat or whatever you do everything for the glory of God. Avoid giving offense, whether to Jews or Greeks or the Church of God, just as I try to please everyone in every way, not seeking my own benefit, but that of the many, that they may be saved. Be imitators of me, as I am of Christ. Here we get to the nitty-gritty of the issue. Liberty is not an end in itself, but a condition that must be maintained against the condition of slavery. St. Paul, and indeed the Bible itself, calls on us to be faithful in difficult times, especially after being liberated from superstition and irrationality, which, for St. Paul, superstition and irrationality are a type of slavery to sin. On the other hand, he also acknowledges that narrow-minded scruples are shackles for those who internalize others' weaknesses. That internalization of another's folly is in itself an inclination to the temptation to sin. And here I agree with St. Paul wholeheartedly, as I think this applies to the situation both during and surrounding the ceremonial performance, its objects, and the gifts given to the Pope by its participants. But some might say that allowing such things is a violation of Old Testament law and precepts. And I, in St. Paul, would retort, but there is only one law for Christians. That is Christ. And that is the law of pure, true love. And here is where the ultra-traditionalist and conservative Catholics get all riled up and call me a liberal. But St. Paul wrote a letter to respond to this inclination for outrage and indignation as well. In 1 Corinthians 5, at verses 9 through 13, he writes, I wrote you in my letter not to associate with immoral people, not at all referring to the immoral of this world, or the greedy and robbers or idolaters, for you would then have to leave the world. But I now write to you not to associate with anyone named a brother, if he is immoral, greedy, an idolater, a slanderer, a drunkard, or a robber. Do not even eat with such a person, for why should I be judging outsiders? Is it not your business to judge those within? God will judge those outsiders. Therefore, purge the evil person from your midst. Here we get to the command not to sit with the immoral people within the church. That is, fellow Christians who are immoral. That does not mean that you must remove yourself from the world that you live in, for non-believers are not expected to be saints. Non-Catholics are not expected to live by Catholic dogma, and non-Christians are not expected to behave as Christians. In fact, Christians have an obligation to reach out, interact with, and be an example of a good person to a non-believer. I would think that it could go without saying that this principle should also apply to the newly converted as they transition from pagan, heathen polytheism to Christian Catholicism. For as that transformation happens, and this synthesis occurs, the one that occurs with all other Christian communities, for them, we must tolerate the folk Catholicism that rises at the fringes of conversion as our religion, as our faith expands into regions or communities that do not understand our sensibilities, when they get it wrong, this is our opportunity to gently yet sternly correct and instruct with temperance and patience. This is how Christmas gets placed on December 25th, the date of the winter solstice, a holiday dating back long before the advent of Christianity. And this is how Halloween gets placed on Samhain. As someone who likes a Christmas tree on Christmas, I have no problem that they all have their origin tied in with Zeus's oak or Thor's tree. And I don't have a problem having All Saints' Day take on some pre-Christian Gaelic influence and traditions. As for the rest, as it relates to pagans, heathens, polytheists, and non-believers, it is the baptized Christian who should refrain from the scandalous sins inherent of mortal human nature. Scandal being the key word here, for it is impossible to avoid contact with sinners, and thus avoidance of sinners should not be a goal, nor should contact with sinners be feared by rightly formed Christians. But instead, the goal should be to maintain inner purity within the Christian community. This is a warning against the perception of impiety from the outside looking in, a warning not to look as if you are condoning sin. It is here that my view on the actions taken by those two Catholics who stole and threw out those figurines changed slightly. While I do not agree with the fanfare and celebration by other Catholics at this action, for that is in itself a scandalous reaction and looks very unchristian to the outside world. The act of removing a temptation to sin from within the church, even if you know it is not a temptation for you, when others do not understand its nature and could be scandalized by it, as many Catholics clearly were. Yes, then yes, get rid of those two images, regardless of whether they were representations of the Virgin Mary that many Catholics found offensive because it went against their sensibilities, or if they were actual idols of some mythical and very fictional mother goddess, then yes, they should have been removed from within the physical church. But what about the people who participated in the ceremony and the performance at the Vatican Garden? Well, St. Paul writes on this too. He wrote in 1 Corinthians 6 at verses 7 through 12. Now indeed then, it is, in any case, a failure on your part that you have lawsuits against one another. Why not rather put up with injustice? Why not rather let yourselves be cheated? Instead, you inflict injustice and cheat, and this to brothers. Do you not know that the unjust will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived. Neither fornicators nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor prostitutes, nor practicing homosexuals, nor thieves, nor the greedy, nor drunkards, nor slanderers, nor robbers will inherit the kingdom of God. That is what some of you used to be. But now you have had yourselves baptized. You were sanctified, you were justified in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ and in the Spirit of your and our God. Everything is lawful for me, but not everything is beneficial. Everything is lawful for me, but I will not let myself be dominated by anything. This is a warning that teaches that the love of litigation is the love of greed, while love of persecution is the love of arrogance and self-pride. This teaches that litigation and persecution of a fellow Christian are forms of retaliation, not justice. Instead, Christians should possess generosity, mercy, and forgiveness toward the sinner and toward themselves. Turn the other cheek after all. For it is faith and grace that saves us from the very worst of our own sins, while self-persecution and the persecution of a fellow Christian or fellow Christians is something that St. Paul was indignant against and was loath to do. Better to be wronged or sinned against than to do the wrong and sin against another. This is Ramon. Channel is Alpha 4. Peace, like, and subscribe. Comment down below. Talk to you all next time.